at least dealing with 2 time zones, one in Brazil, where we have a couple of our colleagues and a lot of online audience participants, and with the afternoon here in the UK. So, and maybe someone at night somewhere else. Cristina Suzina, you may have received messages from me or about the seminar with instructions about how to get here and about to get online as well. Thank you for joining us for this afternoon, for this morning in this seminar. Welcome to Loughborough University London. This is a seminar organized by the Institute for Media and Creative Industries here in London, in partnership with the Institute of Advanced Studies in Loughborough campus, as well in partnership with Cardiff University, the National Institute, let me see if I can speak it correctly, spell it correctly, Instituto Nacional de Tecnologia, de Ciencia e Tecnologia, National Institute of Science and Technology on digital democracy in Universidade Federal da Bahia no Brazil, and TV Nestante, who is responsible for making possible for us to be here and online with all these screens that make us a bit still uncomfortable sometimes, even after all the pandemic rituals. But it is allowing us to have you here and have around, for now, 35 people also attending this session online. And I know that there are some groups attending together. So some of these 35 may be hosting groups with. What else? I need to, before we start, I need to say thank you to many people, starting with people here in this university who have been supporting the Ash, Ben, Sangeeta, Thomas. Thank you for all the support for making this happening. Jesse, who you saw just a minute ago, popping up on the screen, and his team from TV Nestante in Brazil, who is supporting all the technology for online transmission and recording, together with Deepesh here. Thank you for the Institute of Advanced Studies of Loughborough for making it possible for us to have Summer Harlow as a keynote, and also Danilo Rotberg as a moderator and participant of this seminar. Thank you to all speakers that we are going to have and meet in a moment during the roundtables and the keynote. And thank you to Nina and Cesar, who were my partners organizing this program and putting all this together. We are here today actually in the exact same day of the first of the biggest protests that happened in June 2013 in Brazil. So we are actually 10 years after it became a thing, if we can say so, because this protest started some days before in Brazil as regular protests. A group took the streets to protest against the increase of 20 cents over the price of the bus ticket, the transport ticket in the city of São Paulo. We used to say that they started it, but we know that some months before there were other groups protesting against rises on the price of transport in different cities in Brazil. So in a certain way, what happened in São Paulo aggregated complaints and I don't know, I'm mixing Portuguese and English in my head right now, so the words may come a bit strange, but it gathered the momentum that was happening in different places in Brazil, and it helped to make these protests what they became. the days after the 6th of June. What happened? Well, there are many theories about what happened in June 2013 in Brazil. Some very optimistic, some very pessimistic, and some that just say that we yet don't know what actually happened during that month. Concretely, what happened is that the protests started with regular occupation of streets, some kind of what media and authorities would call destruction of elements in the public space. The narrative of vandalism against those on the streets, and police brutality. And some say that the police brutality in one of the moments, in the starting moments of the protests, was what made, especially middle class in Brazil, join the movement in solidarity with people who were in the streets, because as well, there was a counter narrative from alternative media showing that police brutality was coming after nothing. There were people singing in the streets, marching in the streets, and police came with a lot of violence. Some people will say that this was the sparking moment for making a lot of other people come to the streets in solidarity with these groups. Maybe we'll have some more reflections that will help us to understand. Maybe we'll have some other ideas about what made a regular protest against the price of the transport ticket become an event that gathered millions of people all over Brazil. Because what happened after June the 6th is that people took streets in all states of Brazil. We are talking about 27 different states. We are talking about millions of people in capitals, hundreds of people in small cities during a whole month, which is quite important, is one of the biggest movements in the history of Brazilian democracy. And why are we picking up this protest that happened 10 years ago to discuss it right now? Not just because it's the 10th anniversary, but because there are many people who say that politics in Brazil, social questions in Brazil today are still affected by that month. Some will say, as I said before, that the protests affected it positively. Some will mark the protests as the emergence of right-wing and extreme right-wing in the country. And we'll have people here, great people here, speaking about their perspectives, what they have been studying. Some of them, maybe most of them, were in the streets during June 2013. So they are talking about experience. They are talking about 10 years studying and discussing these movements, these protests, and what unfolded after them. So I would just say, I think I should have said this before, for online participants, we have translation to Portuguese. If you want, you can choose in the bottom interpretation, you can choose the Portuguese room, so you can listen to the speakers in Portuguese. For us, it will be only in English. I'm sorry if someone would appreciate the Portuguese. You won't get more Portuguese than my Portuguese words in the middle of some English during the afternoon. And we appreciate if online participants keep mute, because we are recording this, and every time someone opens up their mic, they will be on the screen, and we may get some sounds from where you are. I think this is it. I will invite my colleague Danilo Rothbeck, who is the moderator of the first roundtable, to take this on. Thank you very much, and I hope we enjoyed this session.
I see. Okay, good afternoon, good morning. Welcome to this panel. It's a great pleasure to moderate, to present my presenters, and I hope you enjoy. Thank you for listening. And well, so this panel is titled, What Do People on the Streets Mean for Democracy? And we have three guests, three speakers, and let me talk a little about them for you today. And they are Fanny Vridak. She's here with me from the Free University of Brussels, Belgium. And she conducted her PhD research in political science on the pro-impeachment social movement in Brazil. And her main contribution was a typology of activists' commitment based on over 60 in-depth interviews. And her work primarily focused on the three main organizations that led to the pro-impeachment movement, which includes the MBL, the movement Free Brazil, and it's called Vem Pra Rua, Come to the Streets in Brazil as well. And in 2021, Fanny Vridak received an award for this on a Brazilian subject from the Association of European Brazilianists. We also have here today online, and thank you all for joining us. We have Leticia Birchal Domingues, who is an activist for the right to the city with a focus on public transport. She's part of the Free Fare movement of Belo Horizonte in Brazil, Tarifa Zero, and she's also a PhD candidate in political science in the Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil, and part of the research group on democracy and justice. And she teaches law at the PUC Minas, and she's interested in matters regarding direct democracy, participation in social movements. And we also have here today online colleague Ricardo Fabrino Mendonça. And Ricardo is an associate professor at the Department of Political Science, Federal University of Minas Gerais in Brazil. Ricardo is a research fellow at the Brazilian National Institute for Digital Democracy, and he coordinates the research group Margin. He has had visiting positions at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance in Australia, and many other distinguishing positions all over the world. So that's our three guests, and I would like to invite Fanny to the floor to start our panel, please. Fanny. We plan to have a 10-minute presentation for each one of the three presenters. So that will be half an hour. And after that, we have some time for questions and moderating. Okay, thanks. Please, Fanny, go on. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Danilo. Is that good? 1, 2, 1, 2? Oh, yes, please. So thanks, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here. And as Anna said, this panel addresses a large and important questions that are not easy to answer in 10 minutes, right? But anyway, the organizer provide a wonderful opportunity to step back and reflect on all those major events that Brazil has experienced along those past 10 years. So maybe to start, just a little way back analysis of what happened in 2013 in the streets. Millions of people took the streets. In my country, in Belgium, the event was portrayed by the media as a protest against the 2014 World Cup, right? But in fact, I think that was a massive demonstration to highlight the contrast between the improvements Brazilians had experienced in their daily lives and the dysfunction and dissatisfaction they still had to live with. because despite 3 Workers' Party governments and a period of economic growth, people were still dissatisfied and felt a sense of what we can call a relative deprivation or frustration, if you prefer. A feeling that although life had somewhat improved, they wanted more. So they wanted free public transport, but also for some of them, they also want a hand to corruption. And some of them even won already the removal of the Workers' Party. After the televised episode of police brutality Anna mentioned, which even targeted journalists, there was what we called in social movement theories a scale shift. The initial protest was led mostly by students, right? And the Movimento Passo Livre, which is a activist groups. And the organizer changed his face, and from that day, as Anna said, it was more middle class and working people in the street. And I'm talking about the 2021 of June. And we can see in a survey, could you change the slide? Thank you. I don't know if technique will be on my side. If not, I have a plan B. Will it be possible to click on the link survey over there? I know I'm challenging everything, but oh, nice. That's wonderful. Can you please go a bit downward? This is a survey made by the IBOPI on the 20 and 21, no, just the 21 of June. And we have a few data about those days because everything went so quick. But at least we have this question the researcher asked in the street to the people. Can you go down a little bit? Thanks. More. The manifestation, reason to be on the manifestation, the demonstration. So as you can see, public transport is still the most aggregate demand, but you will see also that political demands aggregate the most people after. And what is interesting is that from the interview I made during my PhD research, and I just maybe, can you go down more a bit? Because what it's really interesting on this survey is to see how many reasons and demands where people gave health, waste with the FIFA World Cup, reaction to the police brutality, and then you go justice, public security. You can go down still. Education, the PEC 37, democracy, right, public administration, and the list goes on. Thank you. You can go back to the slide. So as the survey show, what is interesting, like I say, is that from the interview I made with activists from Revoltados Online, Vem Pra Rua, and MBL, who are the 3 main groups who organized the pro-impeachment movement that happened between 2013 and 2016, all those activists, right activists, were on the street, most of them were on the street in 2013. And they were there to reclaim, to protest again what they perceive as an endemic corruption associated with the Workers' Party way of doing politics. So, way back analysis. Before, you should remember the Mensalon scandal in 2006 during the first Lula government. Among the activists I met, I identify 2 trajectories. The younger generation, a little bit after the Mensalon scandal, start to go on Orkut and Facebook and start to discuss in online groups and exchange what they consider as subversive, I quote using their word, subversive ideas. And those ideas included silly memes of Lula and Dilma and Workers' Party, but also actually literature on conservative and neoliberal economists like Frédéric Hayek and Van Mises. And these young people took the street in June 2013, craving for protest and action. They were really hoping something happened. On the other hand, the second trajectory, the older generation, well, since the Mensalan scandal, was awaiting and hoping to witness a massive protest against the Workers' Party government, against corruption. As you can see on the table here, I summarize a bit. Some anti-corruption protests were organized before 2013, but it wasn't a success as June 2013, of course. So when the 2014 electoral campaign started, it was a surprise to see a large crowd gathering in the street of São Paulo to support Aécio Neves, the Dilma Rousseff opponent. And the media mocked them and made fun of them. And the disappointment was even greater after Dilma Rousseff victory. Because after that day, various groups gathered in the streets, including demonstration calling for a recount of the ballots, because Aécio Neves made a public discourses calling for a recount of the ballots, so people in the street took also that demand. Separation from São Paulo state from the rest of the country, impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, and even a military intervention. And from this November the 1st and this first protest, we could see that a cycle of protest emerged. Various demonstrations start to organize, mostly in São Paulo. And this cycle of protest is characterized by a large panel of activity, from occupation, a march from São Paulo to Brasilia, and really important manifestation. Can you pass? And a second one? Yes, thanks. So here, a summarize of those acts pro-impeachment. The most important one was on March 13, 2016. And it gathered almost 1.4 million people in the streets. So what does all this information, this way back analysis, tells us about people in the streets and democracy? I will share with you some thought, and then we can discuss, if you want, everything. So first, in a democracy, people expressing their dissatisfaction with the political or economic system, right, through street protest is something legal. Although it is considered unconventional within the legal system, it is a legitimate way of engaging in politics. It serves as an alternative means of expressing disapproval of elected power outside the electoral protest. However, when demonstrations lead to the election of an undemocratic candidate like Jair Bolsonaro, it appears as a democratic suicide. So maybe therefore the problem here lies on how democracy can defend itself against its own weakness. And one possible response is the concept of defensive democracy, an approach of democracy that applies rules to prevent those who do not abide by the rules from entering the system. And then, second thought, if we consider the representative system as democracy, and that's theory, in theory, we all agree, then theoretically, people's dissatisfaction should be captured through the electoral process and not spill over into the street. And this logic applies to the Brazilian case if we consider that the classical right-wing party, PSDB, failed to capture the pro-impeachment sentiment. Instead, a significant gap appeared, allowing all the dissatisfaction to be channeled directly into Jair Bolsonaro populist rhetoric. Therefore, in this case, the problem may not lie in the protests themselves, but rather in the deficiencies of the political system. So that will be my contribution, and I'm eager to hear my colleague analysis. Thank you.
Thank you, Fanny, for your words. It's very interesting to know that we have research questions here for debate just in a while. But for now, let me call our second presenter today, who is Letícia Domingues, who is online. Letícia, are you with us? Please go on. Thank you once more for joining us. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear and listen to me well? See and listen to me well?
Yes, yes, we can. Thank you, Letícia.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning for those in Brazil. Good afternoon for those in England. It's a pleasure to be here with you and share some of my perspectives on the June 2013 protests in Brazil. I'm both a protester of the time, well, and a protester of the present, and a researcher of the period. As we will see during the seminar, the June protests were filled with diversity, ambiguities, and contests during and after the cycle of protests. And this is something for us to keep in mind. There were somehow many Junes, and it's not simple to follow its consequences. Therefore, I will highlight some elements that I find most helpful to contribute to answering the question, what do people on the streets mean to democracy? So Brazil was in a different context in 2013. PT was on the power, and we were talking about deepening democracy, making advances that were connected to the quality of life and on issues that we can put under the right to the city umbrella. And there was what I call a Marxist libertarian coalition on the streets before and during June 2013. The term may be better in Portuguese, but I'm taking libertarian as a left-wing political field that puts together anarchists and autonomists, but I think it also makes sense in English. So there was this coalition of Marxist and libertarian organizations and activists that were fighting against the impacts of the Football World Cup on peripheral and traditional populations. We were contesting the unequal access to the cities because of the bus fare prices, as Anna highlighted on her starting notes. And more than that, we were trying to push politics into a more participative model and towards an anti-capitalistic transformation of urban living. So I find that the concept of prefiguration is one that helps us to understand the meaning of the June 2013 protests for those on the Marxist Libertarian Coalition. Prefiguration is the principle that states that to reach an end, a revolutionary end, we must bring to the present the actions as if the future we are aiming for was already here. Through prefiguration, ends and means come together, and actions are guided in a way that we can experience a glimpse of such future. So horizontality, direct action, and the occupation of public and private spaces were actions and principles that we were already experiencing before the explosion of the June 2013 protests. And those were principles that guided us during the upsurge and disputes that happened during the intense days of protesting. We occupied the streets and squares. In Belo Horizonte, the city I'm from, the space under a bypass was transformed into a popular assembly guided by horizontal deliberation. In the end of the protests, we occupied the city council, and around another 30 cities around Brazil had their city councils occupied as well, and other relevant spaces and were occupied in the July and August of 2013. Those were actions that tried to experience the public space in a new and anti-capitalistic way, and to experience decision-making in a more deliberative sense. Creativity, playfulness, and confrontation against ordinary politics shaped those spaces. These experiences were also filled with contradictions and internal dissensions. However, we were open to self-criticism and to creating new solutions as the problems appeared. For instance, as the dispute around the meanings of the protests became more intense, we had to differentiate ourselves from the many protesters that came to the streets with a more nationalistic approach. At the same time, we could not see ourselves as a vanguard because this wouldn't be very horizontal. So we tried to reach consensus on different matters and to create some sort of collective identity around the ways to protest, the trajectory of the marches, and the days of protests. We even reached a very long list of demands on more than 10 different issues that gather different perspectives, but all of them were aiming for more welfare and equality. Part of the prefiguration means that we would think about the limits of our own actions and of what we were experiencing. At the end of the cycle, the experience of public talking and sharing spaces showed limits around the gender division. The social composition of marches highlighted racial and class inequalities. If we're talking about more inclusive and democratic ways of living and creating on the cities, we had to look at those matters. Those issues are not new and come from a long trajectory of their own social movements, but I think that they came into a new light and reached a new generation during those occupation experiences, as we were trying to do things different. The years following 2013 brought more results around gender and racial matters. Those years also brought new features to participatory democracy and electoral experiences, as the collective mandates started to question the simple representation rules on legislative elections. And now I shall end this presentation with 3 ending notes. First, it must be said that the Marxist Libertarian Coalition was brutally repressed on the months and years following June, leaving an open space on the radical left propositions regarding democracy and projects to the national and local politics. Second, there was a diffuse energy of contestation against ordinary politics. The Marxist Libertarian Coalition was able to deal with only a part of such energy. Mainstream actors, the media, police repression, and other new actors were also disputing such energy. The years following June, and especially the ones after the 2014 national elections, changed the matters around which people started to mobilize. Focused more on national politics, corruption, and change of political order towards a right-wing and extreme-right politics, as Fanny has already explored. This is very much different from the June demands for better living, and the extreme right was not relevant in 2013. Third, June was a period of high-intensity creativity. It's only possible to prefigure a better society if we are open to explore and create. We are missing that on the present. And I must say that creativity is an important element to keep democracies alive, as democracy itself is under attack in Brazil and around the world. I hope that we can talk about and imagine new and better and revolutionary futures once again. And thank you. I'm open for the questions.
Thank you so much, Leticia, including for your ending notes, which are being so useful for debate, as with the funniest research questions. So that's great. Thank you once more, Leticia, for joining us in your presentation. And now I would like to invite colleague Professor Ricardo Fabrino Mendonça online too for his presentation. Ricardo, are you with us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes. Thank you, Ricardo. Thank you once more. Please go on.
Okay, so good morning, everyone, and good morning from Vancouver, Canada at 5:46 in the morning. So I hope it works and my ideas work well in the presentation. So just share my screen here. Okay. Just 1 second. Sorry. Okay. Okay, sorry about that. So thank you again. Thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here and to speak about the research project and the 10 years of 2013. So what I'll be speaking in my 10 minutes today, I'll start with a little brief, some context, and I'll talk about the research project, which was titled Protest and Political Engagement. So I'll mainly cover some of the key findings and drop in some keywords on the findings of this research project. And then I'll march towards the main question about the relationship between democracies and the June journeys or 2013 protests. So briefly speaking, and as some of the other speakers have already said, when we think about June 2013, there are many possible reconstructions, and you can reconstruct June in different ways in terms of causes and in terms of consequences. And there are also many shapes in terms of how June actually occurred in different parts of the country and in different moments in time. But the basic story goes that the free fare movement called for march against the rise of public transportation fares in São Paulo. And then you had an escalation in police brutality and international visibility generated by the FIFA Confederation Cup, which brought momentum to the demonstrations. And once we realized that the escalation of the movement in that specific moment, so you had the fare increases were revoked in São Paulo briefly afterwards, still in June, but the protests kept intense, at least until the end of June, with what Fanny and Leticia have already pointed out, a diversification of the agenda in terms of claims for better public services, the indignation with public expenditures, specifically in the context of the organization of mega sports events, the delegitimation of the political system in general. So the idea that nobody represents us, which was so strong in movements coming from the Argentinian Cutibayan Todos to the Iceland protests and to the Occupy, the Indignados, the Turkey Gezi Park, and this idea of no representation, which was getting stronger. And obviously, the fight against corruption, which acquired momentum afterwards and shaped Brazilian politics afterwards in a certain way. So what did we do in terms of the research project? So the research project involved different institutions and different researchers on our, and specifically a collaboration with ESP UERJ, the Federal University of Goiás, Federal University of Pelotas, Federal University of Espírito Santo, the Federal University of Minas Gerais, and also the University of Canberra in a comparison with the Turkish protests. But from our side, what we mainly did was 50 interviews with activists in Belo Horizonte, São Paulo, and a few other later in Goiânia, conducted by Leticia here. We also looked at social media, trying to understand the protests and their the broader context and their consequences. The central aim of the project was to investigate the features of contemporary contentious politics and the change observed in the repertoire of political conflict. So this idea of change in the repertoire of political conflict was key to us and to understand some of the unfoldings of June 2013. So here are some of the findings, and I'll obviously not be able to elaborate on them in 10 minutes. So I'll just drop some keywords and some of the ideas cutting across the project, and I'll be open for questions. But we mainly discussed the idea of that you should look at 2013 as an event that reconstructs its own past and its own future, opening possibilities for different types of unfoldings which are politically disputed. The second thing we discussed is the centrality of identity and how you could think about identity and collective action in these types of protests. And I basically discussed the idea of singularity and how the co-presence and the shared experience of time and space and of emotions and affections was key to create a sense of collectivity in a very diverse group of individuals with different claims and demands, and grievances. And also the idea of protagonism. Looking with Julia Figueiredo, another researcher at Margem, we try to focus and understand how so many people could feel as leaders of this confusing, chaotic moment in Brazilian politics, and how this idea of being a protagonist was relevant for to explain the size and the capillarity of the movement. Another of the key findings is the idea of the changes in the repertoire of political action, and I wrote this with Márcio Bustamante in an article titled "Back to the Future," in which we try to explain how there is a shared repertoire of contention that throws us back to what is often seen as a pre-social movement repertoire of contention of direct, parochial, more local forms of action, but in times of communicative abundance that helps to understand and explain the volume, the modularity, the cosmopolitan nature of these claims. So in a certain way, it is this idea of a back to the future repertoire. We also focus on internal asymmetries, especially on gender, looking at differences in terms of the internal conflicts and asymmetries in the demonstrations. And also with Nina Santos, who will be discussing today as in another roundtable, we were also focusing on temporality and in understanding the rhythms, how the rhythms in time was a key variable, a key dimension to understand the repertoire of contention and to understand, broadly speaking, what was June 2013. Lastly, and now moving to the question, so what's the relationship between protests and these protests and democracy? And we basically tried to do two things. The first thing was to understand how did activists understand democracy? So what do they mean when they speak about democracy? And how do they make sense of the idea of democracy and the idea of enacting democratic agency through their performances? So we focused on different meanings of democracy and try to understand, and these helped us to look at the centrality of direct action in the form that they conceived of democracy, and some of the implications in terms of what we saw afterwards in terms of of how they face representation, political institutions, accountability, and some of the other elements and dimensions of democracy. And with Letícia, we also wrote an article on the dynamics of democratic erosion and comparing different movements, including the June journeys, and looking at how some of the elements in terms of the repertoire of contention and some of the targets and some of the and part of the substance of this protest can be related to what happened afterwards, although, and this is mainly our point, we do not understand the June journeys or 2013 as the cause of what happened afterwards. It is part, and it's an expression of things changing and of several changes going on across the globe, but it's not the cause of what happened afterwards. So what happened afterwards, since so many people are speaking, and I don't know if the audience is completely familiar with some of the events of the following years. So we had the 2014 polarized elections. We had lawfare through the Lava Jato operation. We had a violent removal of Rousseff from power. We had a huge truck driver strike. Then there was Lula's arrest. We had the election of Jair Bolsonaro and the attack on the three branches of power on the 8th of January of 2023. And what does it mean to democracy? So my claim here, and I'll stop here and be open for questions because this is probably the more controversial topic. So the 2013 demonstrations should be seen as an expression of deep social, political, and communicative transformations across the globe. And it should not be seen as an event only happening in Brazil and according to Brazilian forces and leading to all the consequences, but it's a symptom, a manifestation, an expression of broader change. They should be read as the cause of they should not be read as the cause of democratic erosion, although they are pervaded by this process. These demonstrations have open possibilities for different types of actors. And I think it's important to emphasize it, and that's my last point. There's still a struggle going on around its meaning, and simply pretending that there are no legitimate or democratic dimensions in that process has not moved us forward in democratic terms. So I think that people sometimes just throw to of 2013 as the basis of all the nasty phenomena that happened afterwards and the erosion of democracy, and miss some of the dimensions of 2013 that are relevant to think about the shapes that democracy may take in the years to come and how to face democratic erosion, basically speaking. So I'll leave it here and I'll be open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo, for your words, and very thought-provoking. And I guess that we want to have feed for thought here. And well, so let's go for the debate of the first panel of this lovely afternoon. And I want to thank you once more for the beautiful audience that we have here today. And we already have 2 questions from the online audience, but let me make just one general question for your guests here. I don't know if I can say that there is a point of convergence between our 3 guests so far. And I guess that it is about the following events after the 2013 protests, because I think that you both pointed out that the events led to consequences that were unforeseen, right? And but I saw it before. I mean, this point is not new, and but you all gave a different approach on it, and I mean that maybe we can discuss even further this such consequences, because I would like to know from you, and I would like please to ask you for concentrating your answers in not more than 3 minutes each. Sorry for that. It's a very tough job to moderate people, you know. You have to be cruel. But anyway, not long. And what could be done maybe to change the course of events after the 2013 protests? I mean, we had democracy erosion or weaknesses, and what could be done to kind of, you know, prevent it or change the course or to have a better world for us and to avoid the rise of the far right, maybe? I think that's I think we can go on with this question, please. And maybe we should follow the order, starting by Fanny, and then Leticia, and then Ricardo, please.
Well, no time to think then. What could have been done to prevent the democratic erosion, like Ricardo says? I think that summarized really well all that followed the June 13. Well, don't think I'm pro PSDB. It's not true. But looking at my research and the people I met, I do believe that if the PSDB had won the election in 2014 and that Brazil had a political change, switch of party, well, everything would have been different, and all the frustration and the anger, the shame, the fear that I observe in my interviews would have been channeled into a different direction than the streets. And then I also believe that Jair Bolsonaro election was nurtured mostly by the pernicious polarization that followed the pro-impeachment movement cycle of protest. If you do remember, in 2016, when Dilma Rousseff was impeached, there was on the public space in Brasilia a barrier that separated the left from the right, because people couldn't talk anymore. They will fight if they cross against each other. And I think that maybe at the beginning of the protest, 2014, when the first person started to go to the street to publicly, explicitly says, I don't want the Workers' Party anymore. I'm not, I don't like it. I don't like the way Dilma handled the policies and everything. Openness to dialogue with those persons instead of mock them. And I'm targeting the media in that case, but when the movement went on and take more space, then also the dialogue between activism, because this pernicious polarization between left and right was nurtured by a close sectarian position on the two sides, the left and the right. 3 minutes, right?
Yeah, funny. Thank you so much. And I also would like to thank all the three presenters for being on time. Yeah, and so Leticia, are you with us? Can you go on, please?
Yes. Well, I think first thing comes to mind maybe, but from 2013 to 2014, we have the repression that I'll talk about when we're answering the questions from the audience, because there was a question regarding that. But also we have a change of perspective of scale around politics. If I may say, the urban living and quality of life and much matters around the June 2013 protests were more local. And we had a big relevance on the municipalities and the politics of daily lives during the 2013 protests. And on 2014, we have a change of scale towards a national lenses, right? Because we started to talk about national elections. And the way the energy from the street was captured on the national elections changed terms, because we talked about corruption, and there was, of course, there were these people on street as well, but it was not only about that. And maybe if we kept some things local, dialoguing from national lenses, from the national government, trying to reach out local politics, as we see in transportation. We needed a national federal response to the transportation matter, and there was no federal response to the local politics. Maybe if we had a more open perspective to local and daily lives matters, and we're not captured only by elections and electoral results, maybe we would see things a bit different, more participative, more democratic in a large sense.
Okay, great. Thank you, Leticia. Yeah, I think both Fanny and Leticia also had this convergence point, which is maybe the politics would have to take the day-by-day routine, try to speak to the heart of people. I don't know. Maybe Ricardo wants to add to this discussion, please, Ricardo.
Not sure how you're doing with time, and if there are other questions, maybe we could. So I'll just be brief in terms of the democratic erosion and probably connecting to finance response in a certain way. I don't think we should look at the consequences of the Brazilian demonstrations only from a national context, without missing the perception that in a certain way we are facing a huge democratic crisis that has a political dimension, an economic dimension, a social dimension, an epistemic dimension, which is a lot broader than Brazilian struggles. So I think we have to keep that in mind in order to understand the depth of the problem we face, and in order to develop solutions to make democracy more resilient. So I don't like to to frame it as an issue of a dispute between specific actors or parties in a very specific context. But I think we should have it in mind that these struggles are part of a broader dynamics of a changing scenario that should be taken into account in order to face democratic erosion, broadly speaking. So I'll leave it here.
Okay, thank you, Ricardo. So I think we have around 10 or 15 minutes for discussion, and I think this beautiful audience here wants to make a question for your presenters, for our presenters. Yes, please. Would you like to? Yes.
Hi. You talk a lot about the erosion and the threat to democracy. And at the end, there was sort of this idea of what does democracy mean to the people? How do they understand it? I just wondered, what is your view on democracy? Because if you take it as sort of this minimalist Schumpeterian view, it's just the idea of voting. So there's sort of no threat in that sense. So how sort of maximalist or minimalist is your view of democracy, and how has that been eroded? Like what are the aspects of it? Thank you.
Sorry, can I take your questions to all the presenters, or?
Yes, anyone.
Yeah. Okay. So we can make a short round of just anyone would like to present a question to, because then we can have a round and ask the presenters to answer the questions at one time. No, for now, not for now. Yeah. So, oh yeah. So I guess that we should move to all the questions before, and then we have a round of answers. Is that okay for the presenters? So Anna here is going to present the other two questions are online.
Yeah, thank you. We have two questions from online participants. The first one comes from Beatriz Mestre, and she asks, Ricardo, if it is possible to formulate a hypothesis that the governmental repression of the protests was aggravated by external factors, and later justified by the tensions coming from the FIFA World Cup. Would it be possible to think about this lack of control in itself and not as a consequence of something else? And maybe this connects with what Fanny was saying before about the protecting democracy from outside or inside actors. Maybe you both could elaborate a bit on this. The second question comes from Julia Mariano. And she asks a question to Laetitia. I will try to summarize just to save time. She congratulates you, Laetitia, for the discussion you raise about the autonomist, or what you call the Marxist libertarian coalition or left group. And she says that it's not very common to listen any kind of reflection with this approach. She would like you to elaborate a bit more about the persecution against the activists and mainly against the autonomists in June. And what does it mean? What is the consequence of putting all the activists in the same group and not making this kind of distinctions when we are talking about June? Thank you.
So I think we can start again by Fanny, because she's just the first of, please. Thank you.
Okay, so I should apologize because I was thinking about the answer I could give to the public question, and I didn't get the sense of the second question. Could you summarize it for me, please?
It was about because the question raised was about. Was about external factors being important in how June happened, not just what was happening in the streets, but external factors like repression from government or even the tensions coming from the World Cup later, as external factors having consequences on the way it unfolded.
So what are the external factors that can explain the scale shift maybe and the importance the protest took?
Yes.
Okay. Actually, I focus really more on the internal factor within my PhD, and I'm trying to remember in June 2013 what were the stakes, and I'm not sure I can give you a right or an interesting answer. But maybe I will just answer the first one, and maybe coming on, other thought will come. So what are our definition of democracy? Well, no one here is here to listen my own definition of democracy, but I can give you a little bit more about what the pro-impeachment activists told me in interviews. And you should understand that they have a vision of democracy which is really linked to their past and their history. And in the different type of activists I met, there was young person and older, let's say middle-aged person who grew up during the dictatorship, the military regime, who grew up with the idea that politics is something you let in the hand of other, and I quote them, something that is dirty, something you don't mix with. Politics is corruption. And then there were also cut from a lot of information, something that our generation maybe forget a bit, because with internet, right now we have access to all the information we want, maybe too much. And when the 2006 Mensalon scandal happened, those older generation, middle class, middle age, and middle class as well, access to internet and to information to understand the Mensalon scandal. They access also to online group, and they were, let's say, overwhelmed by a lot of information they couldn't make sense of. And the vision of democracy they built on that was a vision of democracy that fit their own value and their need for comfort and security. So it's a vision of democracy which, far from the legal system, it's a vision of democracy where, well, I vote, then the elected party should be me. But this is more of that, of course, but well, I gave you the context. Yeah, and that's the two other have other vision of democracy, but I should let some time to my colleague as well.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Fanny. It's very tough to find time for that. But anyway, can we just go on, and then Leticia can answer the second question, and finally, Ricardo can ask the first question. In fact, yeah, please.
Yes, thank you for the questions. About the one that Julia asked, I think, yes, repression was an important factor for us to understand the events during June and after June, right? So I was with some protesters from Goiânia, and they are from the autonomous groups in Goiânia, and they are autonomous, and they were deeply repressed after June, and those stories are very little known in Brazil, in academia, because, well, it's Goiânia, and they were arrested in not only during the protests, but they were facing criminal charges years after June, as well as the 23 ones from Rio, in ways that made them unable to keep their movements around public transportation, for instance. So the repression was in such a level that many of us could not be organized anymore. So that's relevant to understand this idea that the radical left had left the streets is not very true, because they were made to leave, and in other senses they kept working. So there were groups that were unable to continue, but there were others that got their organizations in a more local level and were not captured by the national elections matters and such matters that came to more light after the 2014 elections. So if we look at the left wing as a more plural way, and if we look at the organizations in the radical left as ones that keep on working in a ground level, in grassroots level, we can see that their work continue. So even though, but not in this big level from 2013 that people may have expected, right? And around fractured democracy and the views on democracy, I think that if we look in a minimalist sense, we can still say that Brazilian democracy, as well as much around the world, is under attack and is fractured. In Brazil, as we have seen from the presentations, we had Dilma's impeachment, we have Lava Jato, we have Bolsonaro as expressions of institutions being under attack. And even if we look at the electoral process from 2022, we had a very turbulent process, and these months following the elections, we have been finding evidences that the process was under attack from Bolsonaro, trying to intervene on the results of the election, not recognizing it. And we had our own Capitolio, right, on 8 January. So in a minimalist sense, we have all this fracture, But in 2013, maybe we were talking about more democracy. In 2013, we're talking in a more maximalist sense of hearing more voices, of more participation, of more local action, getting results. And so there in 2013, maybe we're talking more in a maximalist sense.
Yeah.
That's that.
Okay, Leticia, thank you. So we can go to Ricardo to the concluding remarks, please.
So I'll quickly address the two questions, and I agree with the former responses in terms of our view of democracy, or my particular view of democracy, which I don't know if it's very relevant here, but I come from a deliberative background and dealing with radical forms of democracy and not in a minimalist form. But as Fanny has said, I think the most important thing is what the activists themselves understood. I'm sorry, by the idea of democracy, and I found the same results that she found in terms of how people understood politics and democracy and the idea of self-representation and a broader denial of politics and of democratic institutions, which point in different directions. I think it can point to the need of deep transformations, but also to a denial of democratic forms, depending on how things unfold. In terms of the second question about police brutality being aggravated by external phenomena, I think the visibility of the event in itself was a key element in terms of how the police reacted. But I think that we are a very violent, authoritarian country on an everyday basis in several forms of practices. And police brutality is very common in terms of how society deals with demonstrations. So I think that this is part of the broader context in itself, and was not particularly aggravated by the external phenomenon. I think that the activists face violence on a very routine basis. It's very frequent.
Okay, great, thanks. So we are near the end of this first panel, and I think we've had a lovely time here to start the afternoon, and want to thank you all once again for your lovely audience, for being a lovely audience. And we are going to have the second panel right now, okay? Yes, so yeah, thank you all again, and let's move on. All right.
Thank you, Danilo, for conducting us during the first roundtable as well. We are going straight to the second one, that is called Vandals, Activists, Citizens, Patriots, Alienated Mass, and we will be discussing the narratives about the protests. For this roundtable, we unfortunately had bad news because Nina Santos got sick during this night and is not well to join us for this roundtable. We are going to miss Nina, but we wish her full recuperation, full recovery as soon as possible. And then we are going to have here for the roundtable Cesar Jimenez Martinez. Cesar, beyond being our partner in the organization of this program, he's a lecturer in global media and communications at Cardiff University. His research focuses on the intersection of national identities, protests, and mediated visibility, especially in the context of Latin America and United Kingdom. His research on digital nationalism with Sabina Mihelj was recipient of the 2021 Anthony D. Smith Award, and his scholarly work on the news coverage of the 2013 protests in Brazil was runner-up of the 2022 J. Blumler Best Article Award of the International Journal of Press and Politics. He is author of the book Media and the Image of the Nation During Brazil 2013 Protests, which examines the contestations about the meaning of the Brazilian nation during the June 2013 demonstrations in that country. Welcome, Cesar. I will get my phone because the other bio I have on my phone updated this morning. Okay, recording stopped. Are we getting recording again, please, before we continue? Okay, let's go again. And the second speaker of this panel is Kelly Prudencio, who is an associate professor at Department of Communication at the Federal University of Paraná in Brazil, General Secretary of the Brazilian Association of Researchers in Communication and Politics, Compolitica, in the 2015-2017 biennium. She works mainly with media and social movements, communication and political participation, struggles for recognition, digital activism, and framing studies. Coordinator of COMPA, Research Group Communication and Political Participation, member of the National Institute of Science and Technology and Digital Democracy, which is pretty easier to say when we have it written. And after we got the news from Nina, Danilo Rothberg volunteered to join the panel. As he was not prepared to give a speech today, he will be discussing our colleagues because he also has some research about June 2013. Danilo is professor of sociology of communication at Unesp, São Paulo, Brazil. His subjects of interest include journalism theory and ethics, public communications, media policy, health communication, and popularization of science. He was a visiting fellow at King's College London, University of Warwick, and the Open University in the UK, and Université de Lorraine in France. His publications cover subjects such as communication and water governance, media education, public journalism, right to information and proactive transparency, media framing, digital democracy, social media and democracy. Current projects include communication and democracy, media accountability, public service media, internet access, and the right to information in Germany and Brazil, funded by the Brazilian Ministry of Education, CAPES, and that previous projects include communication and memory in water governance and adaptation to climate change and narratives of water, a cross-cultural exploration of digital hydro-citizenship in the UK and Brazil, both funded by FAPESP. So welcome to our speakers. Thank you for our participants here and online to keep with us. And with no more words, I will pass the word to Cesar, please. Do you want me to tell you when we reach 8?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm very happy and honored to present a little bit of my research here. I'm going to give you an overview of some data that I gathered now several years ago. But I found it always very healthy to return to that data because I remember, first of all, I am Chilean, and I experienced the protest of June through the media. I was not there in Brazil. So people always ask me, were you in the streets? No, and that's why I always say that my research is not about the protest, but it's actually about the version of the protests that was, or versions, I would say in plural, that was communicated in and through the media. And I remember when I was doing interviews in Brazil, and I ended my interviews at the beginning of 2015. And very much the received wisdom among my interviewees was very much like either June 2013 had much ado about nothing. So we had all this noise and actually nothing changed in the end, or actually it showed the strength of the left, and basically how mobilized the left was in Brazil. And basically that was the future for the country. And 3 weeks later, there were protests, the first set of protests calling for the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. And I remember how a couple of years later, I attended a conference and someone talked about 2013 as the fascist protests that happened in Brazil, which was a very different narrative to the celebration of democracy that happened originally. So very briefly, remember like when I was following the stories in the media and the New York Times originally talked about the social awakening in Brazil, which is very different to what we see in 2018, the opinion of Lula. It was very much kind of like how the golpe, the coup started in 2013. That was what was said years later. And also how the protests became over time the standard of measurement for subsequent mobilizations, and also for some jokes, like basically how we're protesting for the public transportation tariffs, and now we have this authoritarian state. In my research, I always find important to go back to the context in which the protests happened. I was mentioning in the previous panel. So basically, there was this very optimistic view of Brazil with the economy growing, the arts, and so on, and also how there was this idea that the country of the future had become the country of the present. Finally, like the unfulfilled promise of Brazil had finally become something else. And if we look at the literature, the academic literature at the time is very much saying, like when we see titles like Reversal of Fortune, Brazil on the Rise, Brazil Emerging, the New Brazil, and also the very famous or infamous car of the Economist of 2009, with Brazil Takes Off, that I'm aware, I'm sure that you're familiar with the subsequent covers him referencing that. And all this contradicts very much the images that started circulating in and through the media from June 2013 onwards, especially through foreign news organizations, and which me as a foreigner who was not following the day-to-day politics of Brazil was also surprised, because it was very much like, wait a minute, wasn't that Brazil were doing things well? I thought that Brazil, like, they organize the World Cup next year and the Olympics, they're the debut of the BRICS. How is that this is happening? How is that people are not happy with the situation in Brazil? So I started looking at data from different media, from some Brazilian media, some so-called alternative, and also foreign media. I chose foreign media mostly from the US and Western Europe, because that's the media that also matters within Brazil. Chilean media is never referenced within Brazil. I also conducted some interviews, and apologies for the self-promotion, but that's the book from where I'm gathering information, and I'm happy to share freely the PDF if anyone is interested. So again, going back to the context, it's important to see if we look at the protests as a communicational answer, we need to see what they were answering or contradicting. And they were very much a narrative put forward by the Brazilian authorities about economic stability, and also that the attempts to build a brand of Brazil at the time, that was the reason why they were organizing these events, and also plenty of claims that they wanted to correct a wrong perception of Brazil, like beyond this erotic and exotic country. So they wanted to show the real Brazil.
Cesar, sorry to interrupt. Can you just come here, because then the camera can get you better for online.
And again, many of the official documents are saying that this idea that they want to show a new, different kind of Brazil to the world. The national media, however, when the protests started happening, they started engaging originally with the classic narrative of the protest paradigm that Summer Harlow studied a lot, about how we have these thugs and bandits which are disturbing, and let's imagine what's going to happen next year with the World Cup. However, very soon they react, and you can see a change. These are two front pages of Folia, one day after the other. And you can see already a change in narrative about how the government is going to be stronger against vandalism, and then the police reacts with violence. And if you look at the images, you can see that. In the case of alternative media, the focus was very much about the criminalization of protests and expose the brutality of the police. And they immersed themselves in the middle of protests to show what was really happening in order to show the viewpoint of ordinary Brazilians. That was the narrative of alternative media, especially media in India. But also the protests became foreign news. And then the protests were framed as one single movement in which a lot of the complexity disappeared. So they were told very much like, these are Brazilians against the World Cup. That's the story, and this is news. And also it was a very romantic viewpoint, the social awakening of Brazilians, and a little bit paternalistic, like finally Brazilians are taken to the streets, like this country that is like, has so many problems, finally we see them then. And also they put them as part of a broader movement. They talk about the tropical spring, even though it was not spring in Brazil at the time, but it was very much like, yeah, we had the Arab Spring, this is the tropical spring. And it's very interesting, the contrast when you see like BBC, just 2 days before the beginning of the protests, showing happy Brazilians taking English lessons to help tourists in the World Cup. And 3 days later, you have the same journalist wearing a mask in the streets of Rio de Janeiro. It's interesting how you start seeing a dialogue between these different coverages, how at some point activists start referencing how well they were covered by The Guardian, by BBC, and that validated them, and also how national media also start saying like, oh, this is what the New York Times is saying about us. So these are not narratives that were in parallel. And there started to be a struggle about the image of Brazil that was mentioned in the media and also by authorities that in some of my interviews, they told me that. Very briefly, and happy to talk this about afterwards. When I started asking journalists, activists, and other individuals why the protests were covering this way, I found plenty of factors that I'm happy to reflect afterwards. One of them were news values that was very much the viewpoint of foreign journalists. It was, well, there was plenty of people in the street, it was violent, and we had the World Cup next year. So that was one of the reasons why they decided to cover the protests. But also they were saying like, well, this was a story that could be very attractive for editors if we leave out the complexity of the protest and start saying Brazil, the soccer mad country, is against the World Cup. And of course, that this is a story that produces profit, and there were commercial imperatives behind this.
8 minutes. 8 minutes.
Okay. Also, it was interesting the role of technologies. And that happened a lot within the Brazilian media. That when I interviewed an editor of Jornal Nacional, which is one of the main newscasts, or the main newscast of Brazilian television, they were telling me that how they have all this avalanche of material coming from phones by journalists, also by coming by their own equipment, and it was very difficult to choose what to show or what not to show. And also in the case of activists, they were trying to communicate their messages, and they were saying like, actually, I put this thing on the internet and I had no idea it was going to become viral. So things get out of control. But significantly, when we talk about the medium, the power of images was really important. People were saying, yeah, media in India were very well known for the videos within Brazil. Outside Brazil, it was the beautiful pictures that were taken. The photos was what made so impactful what was happening on the streets. But something that several interviewees also stressed was very much what was not seen. Because they were saying, actually, protests happen in Brazil a lot of time, but they don't get on the news. Because when they happen in the periphery, they are not news. However, when they happen in the center of the city, when they happen in the Avenida Paulista, and when people started seeing like kids that they could be their sons or daughters, that was something that started getting attention within Brazil and outside Brazil. And this is what a photographer of an alternative media collective told me. He said, like, people from the favela suffering is not news anymore. But people in the streets who are mostly white, with nice clothes, handsome and young, which have this narrative of young revolutionaries, that is an image that can be sold. And I think that is something that we have to take into account, both when we look at the protests, either from the narrative or the original narrative of this triumph of democracy in the streets, or some of the subsequent narratives, which we're talking very much about the fascist movements. And I'm happy to carry on talking more about this in the Q&A. But thank you very much.
Thank you. Kelly, can I invite you to join and and present your thoughts about this to us now, please?
Hi.
Just a minute. Now we are seeing you. Yes, welcome, Kelly. Kelly is from the same state from where I am in Brazil. So we are almost neighbors in the regions. Thank you for being with us, Kelly.
I'd like to thank you. I'm trying here to share my screen. And I'm not finding my, just a minute. Thank you.
Yes, we see it.
Okay. Well, good morning or good afternoon. I'd like to greet everyone and say that I'm very honored to be here, to see again Ana and Danilo and Ricardo, everybody. We used to meet in some congress. I must tell you, first of all, that in the beginning of 2013, I submitted a research project to the university committee with the title, Mapping the Digital Activism in Brazil. At that time, we had no idea of what was about to come. We had proposed to observe how different mobilizations used social media to communicate their demands. We thought there are ways to handle communication on digital environment, combine old and new repertoires of collective action. We started the research in March, or 1 month earlier. What I would like to suggest here, from what we have seen since then, that some aspects of the contemporary collective action are important to understand how we got here. From June 2013, passing through the electoral campaign in 2014, when Rousseff won, despite of the unfavorable conjuncture, the impeachment and her impeachment in 2016, till the election of Bolsonaro in 2018. These were not easy years for Brazilians, and we still don't know what happened, but we continue to work of understanding. As you see in the picture, the picture of March on Washington in 1963, the civil rights movement in the United States. I'm asking now, what we have learned from the theories and research methods of social movements is that they are complex phenomena with social actors in a contention. We use it to observe this project, which is built in a long term, the challengers in a collective identity. We were led to highlight aspects related to expansion of rights. And in my case, what interested us in our research group was the framing of the demands and the way the frame contest took place in the public sphere. So we looked at the mobilization structures, the political opportunities system, the repertoires of actions, and the framing process, like we have learned with Terrell, Tilly, McAdams, Zaud, Snow, Benford, and colleagues. In June 2013, we watched on TV a manifestation against the rise in public transport fare in São Paulo. The announcement of the fare increase mobilized the movement for the free pass, which emerged in early 2000 with the zero fare project, because it understood that public transport is a service that the state must supply. So far, the categories we had were suitable to analyze the reality. We had a classical contest, a demand and a response from the mayor and the governor. Curiously, the mayor was Haddad and the governor was Alckmin. Haddad was the candidate from the Workers' Party to the presidency, and the opponent who lost to Bolsonaro in 2018. Alckmin is the current vice president with Lula. Alckmin, at the time, represented the historical antagonism with the Workers' Party. That protest took place in other capitals. When the increase was withdrawn, the conflict seemed to have ended. Then came in the "it's not for just 20 cents" moment, and the first narrative that we are talking about today. As the rise of Freire was met, other agendas emerged on the streets and social media. At that moment, the protests spread across the country with strong policy repression. It was then the expression, "the giant woke up," or "the giant is awake," appears, supported by different groups, from the left to the right wing. At that moment, mass media, which until was against the protests, began to give them favorable coverage, reinforcing the narrative that there was a widespread discontent in the population. Among the protesters were those who were against the World Cup, a curious position against a law project or a proposal, Packet 37, a prohibition of the use of flags of political parties, a diffuse discourse against corruption. The message they conveyed was against everything that is there, which I stress as a second narrative. All these demands were directed to the government of Dilma Rousseff. The building of Congress was invaded by protests. So, how to observe this phenomenon? Without a clear project, no collective identity, or at least a network of articulated social movements, how to develop a research strategy with the theoretical and methodological resources we had. As we are doing research here in our research group, with the small mobilizations, what we have found was a great difficulty for left-wing movements to handle the interaction tools on social media. The framing process was basically an internal conversation. The diagnostic and the prognostic of the problems were already done. And there was little space to argumentation, what made the discussion not to advance. Movements or groups like Não Vai Ter Copa, something like No World Cup, Não Há Mais Médicos, not to more doctors, which was a government program to hire doctors to work in distant cities in Brazil, took the political opportunity in 2013 to find a way to make their struggles to go to the space of visibility. The government became the easiest target. These no mobilizations were signals for the following events that were about to break out in Brazil. The mobilization around PEC 37 related to a public prosecution campaign was the measures, 10 measures against corruption. The prosecutors understood that PEC 37 restricted their text of investigation and argumented that it could impair the struggle against corruption. This narrative, the main problem in Brazil is corruption, found a fertile terrain to grow. That helps to understand the success of right-wing movements like Movimento Brasil Livre or Free Brazil movement and Vem Pra Rua, Come to Streets. On social media, they managed to get high engagement, unlike the progressive groups. This mood also promoted Lava Jato, the federal police task, is well known as everybody. So we can say that Movimento Brasil Livre and Lava Jato have fostered public distrusts of politicians and politics. The more visible consequences of which were the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in 2016, the imprisonment without evidence of Lula da Silva in 2018, and the election of Bolsonaro in the same year. Sérgio Moro, judge from Lava Jato, resigned his job and became Minister of Justice in Bolsonaro government. Other struggles, like the feminist ones, in their turn, kept discussing gender question, like, for example, the slut walk with the slogan, "My body, my rules." The march for the humanization of childbirth, for example. I put feminist here because these mobilizations fed what later became focus of a resistance movement, or a network of resistance movements. Along with the growth of conservative and moralistic groups, the women put themselves in front line of contention politics after 2013. The women staged the largest protests against Bolsonaro during the presidential campaign known as Ele Não, or not him. Although women didn't win that battle, the feminist movements were able to bring together diverse demands, inequalities under the discussion of gender, but not only gender, which seemed to us promising for the research. What have we learned from these years? Sometimes research tend to be suspicious about social movements because they don't want to be biased by their political preferences. Perhaps the major lesson about June 2013 is that we must pay attention carefully on what reality can show us. Not always our background is enough to interpret empirical reality. As Alberto Melucci has taught us, social movements constitutes an analytical concept, not an empirical reality. We can't see social movements, we just correlate aspects of a collective action. So I'm suggesting now here for us, maybe an agenda. I mean, maybe we should try question problems beyond polarization. The reality is not a question of yes or no, or I'm in favor or I'm against something. We should try also revisit theories and methodologies. We can call for more qualitative research after the boom and enthusiastic movement we had in our groups of research with the techniques of interpret big data. We should call for develop interview techniques to catch the Weltanschauung in everyday life and how it affects politics. I mean here Weltanschauung as a concept from Karl Mannheim to interpret how people can contribute to the political life with subjects that affect these people more personally. We should try to look at social demands and the question of identitarians. We have noticed that after 2013, after the electoral campaign in 2018, that this was the most significant phenomenon that appears here, at least in Brazil. We have to pay attention on it. And the hard tasks of conciliate the struggle for equality and difference. How to advance so in political policies. What I'm here to say in this short presentation, that we must consider how these narratives affected our research work. I'm really interested in how can we produce more consistent evaluations of what happened. So back to the title of this presentation, we still don't know what in 2013 in Brazil. We saw a lot of things, but I think in the case of our research groups, our research projects, and our research strategies, we have a lot to do yet. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kelly. I want to invite now Danilo to come here, and with the challenging mission of tapping into what our colleagues said and connecting with your research as well, please. you want me to tell you when you reach 5 minutes?
Yes. Okay, hello again. I think you have to sum up what has been spoken and make it easier for all of us to understand what's said. And well, thank you once more for being invited for this lovely afternoon. And I would like to discuss both presentations, both Cesar and Kelly's presentations. And thank you for bringing this for us. And nice to see you, Kelly, again. I think that my point is that both narratives, these one presented by Cesar and those presented by Kelly, can also have a convergence point. And I think it's interesting to think about how both narratives developed into what we got today, right? And because many characteristics of the current political moment in Brazil could be foreseen if we had a vision to the future. So I think everything goes on and we don't know really what's happened. And then that's the title of Kelly's presentation. And I think it's very useful to think in that terms, right? Because I think that kind of chaos portrayed by the media, which Cesar tells us about, was important element of creating a picture that would be a guide for everyone to get a sense of what the 2013 protests were, because people couldn't tell what was going on, and they can't do it even today, right? So, and of course that the media offered a kind of contribution to that messy vision of the events. But I also think that that's a contribution from the media that could be expected if we follow the journalism theory, because we know that media coverage would be just scattered and fragmented. But anyway, then we can say that the media didn't have a good contribution to citizenship or to informed citizenship, because you wouldn't be able to get a real sense that or either the country was waking up or not, or just being immersed in a kind of war of narratives. And in that war, there were no survivors, I think, because no one would stand with a good or a clear picture of what went on during these protests. And I might give you an example of this because I teach to this undergraduate course in communication in Brazil in the São Paulo State University. It's a public relations undergrad course. And I also have a particular day, it's a class on the June 2013 process. And my students now are 20 years old, around that. Their social background is just middle class. It's a free, we don't have tuitions, it's a public university. So we would suppose that they would be well informed about what happened 10 years ago, right? And it's just a coincidence that I had this class the week before coming to the UK, right, 2 weeks ago. So it was amazing because I even snobbed that I was going to speak something about this today. And I said them, well, I'm sure that we are completing 10 years of the 2013 process. So I'm aware that you are aware what went on. And maybe some of you took to the streets by your parents, right? You were 10. And, you know, everyone looks to each other, and well, of course, they didn't have anything about that on their history or geography lessons in the high school, but they did have a sense of the meaning of the protests to the bad situation we were in during the Bolsonaro's years, right? And that kind of sense, and then I speak to Kelly too, is a sense that something went wrong. And like the joke that Cesar showed us, you went to the streets just to protest against the bus tickets and ended up feeding authoritarian movement that turned the country into an evangelic totalitarian state, right? It's a real impression that we had, in fact, living in Brazil. And then I think the kind of populism that we had during the Bolsonaro's years was kind of authoritarian populism. And it's been called by many as a kind of authoritarian accountability, which is an idea that I've been developing with some colleagues in Brazil, and will probably be published in a book chapter coming out soon, I guess. And by soon, I mean by 2026, right? If you understand me in the press publishing business. But anyway, we came up with this concept. I think we can start a dialogue between this concept and both presentations we had here from Cesar and Kelly, because this narrative of change, which gained the streets after 2013, developed into a narrative of change to a far-right world view. It's a kind of mindset that requires or demands order, right? So order would mean the only solution for corruption. And that's why many wanted to revive the dictatorship days and claimed for the military to take over again, which is crazy, of course. It's a very minority voice. Don't worry, we're not going to have a new coup d'etat. We're safe so far. But anyway, there was a real danger of things turning bad again in terms of more police repression, and also in terms of the moral view of society, denying women's rights, reproductive rights, and also racism and discrimination against the poor. We have a strange word in Portuguese for that, and even I don't remember. But anyway, I think it's a problem of having a great, a gray mindset of things of society to go under order. So police has to impose law and order, and also the president. So anyone against him is an enemy of the people. And then we have the polarization, very typical of the populism around the world. And then it happened in Brazil too, within a very particular way of seeing things. Because then families wouldn't be allowed to have their own vision of democracy, because the only official vision of democracy should be the one which is defended by the president. So only the president and his supporters would know what democracy should be, should mean for everyone, right? So I think that's the point that I want to suggest, and again, that's all right. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Danilo.
Thank you. Thanks.
I would ask Kelly and Cesar if you want to comment or react to the comments raised by Danilo, if you wish. Yeah.
Should I sit there?
Yeah.
And maybe take this one. Thank you.
And I would then collect some questions here with you on site. And I know there are already some, we have already some questions from online. We will have a second round to attend this.
Well, thank you very much, Danilo. You're making some really, really good and important points in your intervention. And when you were talking, what I was reflecting was in the power and significance of narratives, but also of memories. And I found really important how the protests were narrated while they were happening, but also the way in which they have been remembered. And I think that I started looking at them while they were happening through the media, and my writing was like very much afterwards. Well, I was writing my research at the time of after the impeachment of Dilma, when Temer was president and when Bolsonaro had not been elected yet, but you could see that coming. And it was very interesting to see some of the blind spots of previous narratives, especially when more research started to appear. When, for instance, I discovered the research by Fanny, and which was saying like how many of these movements that ended up playing a significant role emerged in 2013. However, when talking to people in 2014 and 15, there was very much this beautiful narrative of how the left and progressive forces were in the street. I remember only one person who told me, I'm scared of something that I saw once. I saw this in the street, but it was a minority. Many other people within Brazil, but also outside of Brazil, was kind of like blind of that. And I think there were plenty of academics also that took a very romantic viewpoint of what was happening in Brazil. Like, look how beautiful Brazilian povo is there. The people that are taking the street, this is progressive, this is amazing. And that is something that I've seen also in other social movements, especially that happens with Western academics when they look at Southern movements, that they take this very romantic view. And there was not a moment to stop and saying like, maybe things are much more complex than what we're thinking. And I can understand how difficult it is because things are happening on the moment. But also, I think partly happened because there were some Brazilian academics at the time, that were PhD students, who were also activists. And sometimes their research, and that fits with the point that Kelly was making, was very much closer to their desires and to their hopes of what would happen, rather than to what was effectively occurring in the streets. So I think that yeah, going back to your point about the significance of narratives, I think that I will also ask the significance of memories, and how we continue to remember, and how, as Kelly was saying, we still don't know what happened. And I think that that's a really good summary.
Thank you, Cesar. Kelly, would you like to join, please?
Yes, thank you, Danilo, for your questions. I know. I think it's I'm especially interested in how we look at this phenomenon 10 years later. I think as you said, the narrative of anti-politics, anti-establishment, all politicians are corrupt. This fed this another narrative that we must have changed at that time. So it's a very complex. In terms of research strategy, I think it's good to compare how, as Cesar has presented, news framing, the framework built by the newspapers and the press, and how social movements and activists and protesters framed their demands on the public sphere. You know, it's a very different thing. And well, if you can talk all day long here, we are going to tell the history of how these newspapers, at least in Brazil, represent a point of view of the middle class. I think Fanny has told something about it previously. So we can look at how the the press is organized in Brazil, how the social movements act historically in Brazil, to understand the way this discussion, this public discussion and these debates are conducted in Brazil. We were caught in, as we say here in Brazil, with, I don't know if it makes sense in English, with short pants, you know, with short pants. And after Ana Suzina can explain that, so I can't at this moment, because we didn't know how to interpret. So journalists didn't know how to interpret, because historically social movements are criminalized in journalist coverage. And for the first time in years, social movements was the good side of the force, you know. So we are still thinking about this. I think this narrative of the corruption is very strong. Now we are seeing, I don't know if everybody is watching what is happening today in Brazil. All the world built by Lava Jato is falling down. It's falling down. It's Sérgio Moro and the prosecutors who conducted Lava Jato are probably be arrested by corruption crimes. So it's ironic and tragic at the same time. So we have passed through these 10 years with Bolsonaro, with impeachment process, and the views and our narratives, just to use this term we are discussing now, are very, I don't know how to say it, but we are lost in translation, really, literally. So something has asked here in the chat, how can something or somehow can manipulate the narratives? I think this manipulation is not a thing that we think about it, or let's manipulate, but the way that this information circulates in the society. So it's so difficult to make research about this process of communication, who is all over the relation, the social relations. So I don't think I can answer, because I'm going to I would like to return to my presentation title. You know, we still don't know.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. I would come now to questions. Do we have a question here in the room? Yeah.
Hi, everyone. So my question would be about one aspect of those protests that was more from like the end of June. Media coverage started to emphasize the presence of black blocs, you know, those protesters that set fire on banks and on other public buildings. And do you think, and it was at some point, it was so intense, this coverage, that all media talked was about this bad side of the protests. Do you think this kind of coverage and this frame that became the main frame at this point interfered with the way we remember the protests of 2013?
Thank you. Thomas, could you please help us and read the questions from online?
Okay, we have two questions from the onliners. One from Beatriz Mestre, who's asking again, thank you very much to both presenters. I'd love to ask both Cesar and Kelly about their opinion. Well, Kelly, you've half answered it already, but your opinion on narrative manipulation. To what extent is it possible to manipulate a political narrative to serve a certain purpose? If a government or a media outlet has a specific agenda and living in the age of information, is it becoming more dangerous to trust political narratives on protests and demonstrations in general? Can we look at situations like these as who controls the narrative controls public opinion? Is Bolsonaro a product of that? And there are, I think, now 2 more questions. Anna, should we take these 2 first, or do you want another one? And then we have one from Tiago Trindade, who says, congratulations for the event. He asks, we know that along the traditional media, social networks help to create frameworks to represent the protesters and their narratives against the police violence. Currently, the same media that helped circulate different discussions and political perspectives also supported the spread of fake news and the consequent election of Jair Bolsonaro in 2018. I would like to know from the speakers their perspective about the issue and the role of digital corporations in the debate about their regulation in Brazil.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you for the questions. I would invite Cesar and Kelly to answer those questions, but also to address your final remarks, taking into consideration the questions and anything else you may want to say, please. Kelly, could you start now, please?
Well, thank you for your interest. My presentation tried to bring this discussion about how we look at this phenomena, these questions. We have a big agenda of research to do. So who controls public opinion? If the platform, for example, we didn't discuss the role of platforms in this narrative. So I think we should look at these platforms, but in a different way, not just to look for who said what, but how these framings contribute to a narrative that circulates. In this case, mass media still matters. So mass media, especially TV, still matters, and I think we researchers are going too fast to abandon these studies. So I'd like to see more researches about these images, like in the work of Cesar. How this, in the long term, how we get to that, how we get to this, how could we accept Jair Bolsonaro, right? How could, in these years, we let this happen? So I'm going to do another question. We still don't know what happened, but we still must ask, how could we let this happen? So I think we must distrust this attitude in researchers, but not only, but in political analysts, that how relevant or how important or how relevant is this neutrality? You know, we know something we know is this neutrality was very dangerous, and we took the risk of this neutrality in the beginning of this June demonstrations and after. So I think we must rethink about this neutrality. We are not, we must not to confuse scientific neutrality with ideological neutrality. So I think this two kinds of neutrality was mixed up in this period. I thank you very much. I'm going to stay here to see the other roundtables, the conference, and I invite you to join us in the afternoon here, at night here, there, of the roundtables with the Institute of Technology in Digital Democracy here in Brazil. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kelly.
Okay, I'm going to try to address together the different questions. So the first is that I'm quite wary of using the word manipulation, because manipulation for me brings to mind the image of kind of like a dark room with a bunch of people wearing suits, like ha ha ha, laughing like villains, and deciding what to do something and saying we are going to narrate the protest in this way. I find much more, based on my interviews, what happens that is something more problematic than manipulation, which is the power of routines. And something that I saw when interviewing journalists, where when they were telling me, after 3 days, we did not know how to cover the protests. And they say that because they say, we know how to cover protests usually. We know we go, we interview the police, we interview the passersby who tell us like how they couldn't go to the office because of protests. And then we do that usually with all protests. But then when this one started happening, that formula worked for 3 days. And that's the routine that journalists use, routines to templates to cover both stories. And there was a moment in which many of them told me, we didn't know how to cover this. We had no idea, which, by the way, nowadays I'm doing research on the protests that happened in Chile in 2019, and journalists say something similar. After a few days, we don't know how to cover protests, and then they get lost, and they don't know what to do in those cases. So that is one thing. About the black blocs, yes, I think that it's very interesting how significant at some point there was a discussion about the black blocs and how they were very much criticized and they were much positive, like the kind of like the responsible, even by demonstrators themselves, of distracting the reasons, the grievances behind the protest. But I think that what happened at that moment was that both legacy / mainstream media, but also alternative media started paying a lot of attention to the violence and damage of the protests. The difference was the focus on responsibility. So there was a lot of coverage saying like, we're having all the destruction because of the black blocs, or they're ruining the protests. But also, and this is a reflection that a former photographer of Media Ninja told me. He said at some point, we also started doing the same, but paying all the attention on what the police were doing. And instead of reflecting, why are people in the street? Instead of like trying to figure out why are people taking over all these different cities, we also fell, he was saying, into something similar, but paying attention to who was beating who, what was the violence of the police and so on, which I'm not suggesting at all that should not be reported. It should be, and it's very important. But at some point, they also fell into sort of spectacle, into showing, like if we look at many of the images of Media Ninja, many of the most famous images are of police brutality, very much of, and those are the images that made Ninja famous, rather than images that could prompt a discussion to try to understand what Kelly was saying, trying to understand what we don't know about that. And I think on that, digital media was also important, but I agree with Kelly that at the end of the day, we are a biased bunch of people. We are either activists or academics and so on, and we passionately live those weeks. But most people, they were not in the streets, or they were just briefly, and their perception of what happened were like the 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes that they saw in Journal Nacional. And that's what they got. And that's the people that sometimes we need to reconnect with. And maybe that's the people that we also need to research with. Because many of those people who saw all these images of damage and violence and whatever frames were the ones who got scared, and were the ones who said, oh, wow, now we need order. Now things are chaos. And I say that because something similar also happened in Chile. Like many of the narratives also were very like, in Chile was quite curious because the equivalent of the black blocs, the Primera Línea, were very much romanticized for a while. Even within the so-called mainstream media, like they are defending us. However, nowadays, the protests in Chile are seen very much like that was just a bunch of thugs. And Chile is also moving dangerously to something that Chile could have its own Bolsonaro in a couple of years. So I think that's why we need to pay attention, not only to audiences like us, not only to the media, not only to activists, but also to the people who watch those 15, 20 minutes very quickly of images at the end of the day. And I think that's where also research is needed at the moment.
Thank you very much, Cesar. I will end this roundtable taking away with me that maybe one of our missions is to recover complexity, both in journalism and research, because I think both of you, in a certain way, invited us to think twice before trying to summarize things. So thank you very much for your contributions. We'll have now 20 minutes break, and we have coffee just outside this room here for those who are on site. I hope you online, you will be able to get something, a coffee, a water, or something that you like close to you. And we are meeting again here in the same room, in the same link, in 45, whatever the hour you are using. We are 25 here right now, and we'll be gathering here again at 45 for the keynote with Summer Harlow, who is already here with us, where we will try to associate in a certain way what happened in Brazil with other parts of the world. And as Kelly said, all of you are invited to join the Portuguese continuity of these debates that will be taking place online, organized by our colleagues in Brazil. So enjoy your coffee, and in 20 minutes, welcome back. So I know that there are some of our colleagues still getting their coffees and grabbing things there, but maybe we should just start again. Yeah, because then we can more or less keep the agenda. Thank you for coming back from the coffee. And you as well, thank you for coming back from your coffee or water or any rest that you take from the debate. And we are ready for the keynote of this seminar. And I will pass the mic to my colleague Burcu Çelik, who is here to introduce our keynote.
Well, welcome everyone in the room and also online. So my name is Burcu Çelik, as Anna said. I'm reader in media and creative industries at Loughborough University London. So I will briefly introduce Summer, and then we'll just move into her talk. And then after 40 minutes or so, we will have Q&A sessions. So I will be having your questions. Or we will be having your questions. So Summer Harlow is an award-winning associate professor of journalism in the Jack J. Valenti School of Communication at the University of Houston. Her research focuses on the intersections of social movements, social media, and journalism, particularly in the US and Latin America. In 2018, she was recognized with the Outstanding Junior Women Scholar Award from the Copenhagen Center for the Advancement of Women in Communication. Dr. Harlow teaches modules we call it, not courses, in the UK, social movements and news coverage, social media reporting, and immigration reporting. She also teaches classes in University Houston's Hispanic Media minor. So let's welcome Summer with our applause. And
Thank you. And take this off. And thank you to our conference organizers. I think they deserve another round of applause for putting together such a great event. And also, I want to say thank you to the presenters who went before me, because everything that y'all talked about is just fitting in so well with everything that I'm going to say today. So I couldn't have asked for better presentations to come before me. And I also want to thank Loughborough London and IAS for having me here as a fellow this week. It is such an honor and such a privilege to be able to speak with you all. And thank you especially, of course, to Dr. Ana Cristina Suzina for the invitation. I'm just thrilled to be able to be here with you all. And I was asked today to talk about the June 2013 protests and the rise of the right and the role of journalism and media in the protests, and how the June 2013 protests dialogue with other protests around the world. And for the record, they do, right? The June journeys, as they're referred to, they originally started, as we heard earlier today, because of an increase in transportation costs of just a few cents. And so people took to the streets to oppose that. And this came on the heels of the Arab Spring in 2011, the Indignados movement in Spain, Occupy Wall Street in the United States. And so all of those anti-establishment protests and movements that were really mobilized in part via social media, we saw that happening in June of 2013 in Brazil. And then, of course, we also see other ways that those protests resonated in different ways with other movements around the world. Chilean protest songs were used during the Brazilian protests, and Turkish protesters communicated with the Brazilian protesters about tear gas and other information related to that. The narratives about patriotism and democracy and what it means to be really Brazilian, those types of nationalist narratives that we saw in the Brazilian protests, those were also present in the Guatemalan protests in 2015 that ousted a president and ousted a vice president. And then we talked a little bit about this in the last session, the narratives about, or the violence against protesters and the violence against journalists that we saw in Brazil helped shift somewhat the media narratives and public opinion to be more favorable toward protesters. And we also saw that to an extent in the United States in 2020, during the racial justice protests after George Floyd was murdered. But the more I started thinking about all of this, I realized I can't talk about all of that in 30 to 40 minutes. It's just too much. So what I decided to do is look for some kind of through line that could help unravel that knot of what it is that led from the 2013 protests to the 2015 anti-impeachment protest, or not anti, pro-impeachment protest, to the actual impeachment of then President Dilma Rousseff, and then eventually get to the arrest and imprisonment of former President Lula, the election of President Jair Bolsonaro, somebody on the extreme right, and then his election loss, I guess, the re-election of Lula, and then the attacks on the Capitol, or not the Capitol, but Brasilia and the centers of power earlier this year in January. And again, that's a big knot to unravel. And so the through line that I picked was to really look at the emergence of new media actors and how they are contesting mainstream media power. So that's what I'm going to focus on today. And when I talk about the new media actors, in particular, I'm referring to conservative social media and online independent digital native media. And when I refer to independent digital native media, I'm talking about those financially and editorially independent online-only news sites born online without any sort of offline counterpart. And these are sites that challenge hegemonic mainstream media by really taking a stance and focusing on defending human rights and promoting democracy and taking more of a social justice approach to reporting. And here is a shameless plug for my new book. If you're interested in learning more about those independent digital native news sites throughout all of Latin America and not just Brazil, you can get a discount right now. But so what I really want to think about then is knowing that independent digital native media and conservative social media played such a big role in the 2013 protests. How can we think about how the rise of the right really relates to the rise of independent digital native media, the rise of conservative social media, and how these two new media actors were able to create potentially these counterpublics on social media. And then those counterpublics, of course, have implications for both democratic and anti-democratic mobilization. And so, just so I can keep track of where I am at, I want to situate us, though, first within the Brazilian media landscape, because I'm sure some of you aren't necessarily too familiar with Brazilian media. And Brazilian media, this is nothing new. They have long had problems with media concentration, media oligopolies, lapdog more than watchdog journalism, a lack of plurality, things that really are important for us to understand because they contribute to that relationship between the press and power. And it's really key to understanding that relationship when we're talking about protests, of course. And this relation, or this media environment, of course, is being changed by what else but the internet. And we know that according to the latest survey data from the Reuters Institute for Journalism, 2/3 of Brazilians now get their news via social media. And so as Kelly was talking about recently, yes, it's important to still look at TV, it's still very important, but TV and print continue to lose ground to online media. And this rise of the use of social media for news comes during this erosion of trust in the media. And we know that in Brazil, as well as around the globe, we have decreasing social capital, increasing economic inequalities, increasing polarization, the decrease in media trust, as well as a decrease in trust in political parties and political institutions. And all of this in this post-truth context, right? Where we have more misinformation and more disinformation. And we know that there are links between this erosion of trust and the demonization of the press and a decline in mainstream media use. And that decline in mainstream media use is also accompanied by more and more people turning toward alternative media, or really fringe media or extreme right media. And this is where conservative social media have found a place, not just in Brazil, but around the world. And when we think about conservative social media and independent digital native media, we know that social media generally, not just conservative, but social media, they cover protests differently than mainstream media. And Cesar briefly mentioned the protest paradigm earlier. Well, the protest paradigm says that mainstream media, legacy media, they tend to follow this pattern that delegitimizes protests and protesters. They use framing to focus on violence and destruction and the spectacle and drama of a protest instead of really focusing on the context. Why are people out there protesting to begin with? What are their grievances? What are their demands? Why does this protest even matter? And mainstream media also tend to focus more on the voices of authorities and officials so that the voices of the protesters get drowned out. And the result of this is that this negative delegitimizing media coverage negatively impacts protest mobilization and the ability of protests to gain support. And this matters because we saw that in 2013, the mainstream media initially started covering the protests in this very negative delegitimizing way, following that protest paradigm. But about halfway through June, things change. We see that those media narratives start to shift, start to become a little bit more supportive, more legitimizing, less delegitimizing when journalists get injured, when protesters start getting injured. But at the same time, that's also when we see that the protest narratives about what protesters want expands. The agenda expands. It's no longer just about opposing that higher transportation costs. Now it's about health and education and transparency in economic issues. It's about anti-corruption. It's about democracy. It's about being anti-PT or anti the Working Party, which was at the time the leftist party that was in power. And we also know that the protest paradigm is impacted by ideology. And ideology is important because if the mainstream media is conservative and pro-status quo, and the protesters are leftist and anti-status quo, well, then it makes sense that coverage is probably going to be delegitimizing. It's probably going to follow that protest paradigm. But in the case of Brazil, suddenly the media, conservative, pro-status quo, they're no longer following that paradigm. And it's because they realize that this new expanded agenda of the protesters actually aligned with their own ideologies, right? It wasn't just this leftist decrease in transportation fares anymore. Now the protesters were talking about things that could potentially delegitimize the PT. And yeah, the media can get behind that. And so that's how mainstream media then typically cover the protests in that negative way, except when their ideologies align. And even the original conception of the protest paradigm acknowledges this, right? The original conception of the protest paradigm was based off of student protests in Hong Kong in the 1970s. And even it said, if media are leftist, they're going to be friendlier toward leftist protests. And if they're conservative, they're going to be friendlier toward conservative protests. But while we know a lot about how pro-status quo media cover protests, we know less about what happens when the media interests of the protesters, when the ideologies and the interests of the protesters align with the interests of the media. Whenever those ideologies align, we don't know very much about that. We also don't know very much about how long that alignment in ideologies might last and what might potentially break that affinity. Like, say, a president like Bolsonaro, who's constantly accusing the press of being enemies of the people. And so while corporate mainstream media might follow that protest paradigm, one thing we know is that social media generally don't. They tend to social media users tend to interact more with legitimizing content that focuses on what protesters want, that focuses on their goals, that focuses on their demands and their grievances. And independent digital native media, my research has shown, also cover protests differently. They also focus more on the substance of the protests and less on the violence, less on the destruction, less on those negative delegitimizing aspects. But so understanding how the paradigm operates in mainstream media, digital native media, and especially conservative social media is really important because it's going to have impacts on mobilization, especially when we think about whether it's democratic mobilization or anti-democratic mobilization. And so, as I mentioned, protests or media have long impacted protests, right? That idea of mobilization. And we talk in social movement literature about how political opportunities are something that also impact protests. And so while we think about the political opportunities that impact protests or how the media impact protests, we really think less about how the media or how protests might impact the media. And so that's what I want to do, is kind of flip that idea of that media impact protests and instead look at what kind of opportunities might the protests of June 2013 continuing until today, how might this 10 years of protests actually impact the media? And I argue that there are two opportunities that protests have actually provided media. The first is an entrepreneurial opportunity for the emergence of these new media actors, both independent digital native media as well as conservative social media. And then the other opportunity is that of circulation of narratives. Whoever controls the circulation of narratives has power, has media power. And so the idea here is that the protests afforded independent digital native media, as well as conservative social media, the opportunity to spread their reach, to extend the diffusion of their messages, and then potentially create counter publics. Counterpublics, of course, are those discourse arenas where typically marginalized voices can circulate counter narratives that challenge whatever the dominant mainstream public sphere is. And counterpublics are important because, again, they have an implication or impact on mobilization. So when we think about that first opportunity that I mentioned, right, the entrepreneurial opportunity for digital native media, we see that the independent digital native news site called Media Ninja, they are sort of the exemplary case of protests offering this entrepreneurial opportunity. So Media Ninja, Ninja being the acronym in Portuguese for Independent Journalism, Narratives, and Action. And this Media Ninja group, they really came into the spotlight in 2013 because of this incredible way that they live streamed the protest directly from the streets. And their posts on social media, these videos that they were doing, these were in direct contrast to the videos, the very traditional videos that mainstream media were broadcasting. And Media Ninja says that they were created because they were fed up with mainstream media. They were fed up with the way that mainstream media covered social justice issues and including protests. And they claim to be independent. Now, there are some who question that, but they say that they are not aligned with any political party, nor are they aligned with any kind of financial corporation or company. And it is that independence that allows them to be more critical and to cover protests differently. And they, this independence and their ability to cover things differently then allows them to really, again, focus on just social justice, promote and defend human rights, and take actions that normally we wouldn't see happen in mainstream media. And the research that I've done on independent digital native news sites throughout Latin America, including Media Ninja, shows that for groups like this, the violence and sexism and all of the problems with mainstream media created entrepreneurial opportunities for them to emerge. And we see that protests really fit into that category as well. But it's not just independent digital native news sites that were able to take advantage of this entrepreneurial opportunity that the protests afforded. We also see that conservative social media took advantage of this. And I mentioned earlier that about halfway through June is when we see that mainstream media narratives shifted, but we also see that the protest narrative shifted, right? Their agenda expanded to include all of these other issues that really paved the way ultimately for the delegitimization of the PT and the eventual impeachment of Dilma Rousseff in 2016. I'm losing track of my dates now. And really also contributed to the rise of that anti-party sentiment that eventually would sweep Bolsonaro into power in 2018. But when we see these media narratives, or I'm sorry, these protest narratives shift, is also when we see a new media actor come onto the scene. And that is the group O Gigante Acordou, or the Giant Awoke. And their Facebook posts really illustrate this expanded media, this expanded protest agenda. Unlike the original social movement that was posting on Facebook that really focused on transportation fares, the Giant Awoke does not. The Giant Awoke is focused on healthcare. It's focused on education. It's focused, as this one woman sign says, it's focused on everything, right? So many things, they don't fit on this sign. And then she uses the hashtag Vem pra rua, come to the street. Remember that hashtag. We're going to come back to that. And this is when we also really see that anti-party sentiment or that anti-establishment sentiment. And the second meme there, you can see it says, we're protesters without party because we are the people. So this idea that they're opposed to parties, they're not associated with any political party, is interesting because they don't claim to support one party or the other, but they are very explicitly anti-PT and explicitly pro-right. And then we see, by the time we get to 2015, another social media actor here. And this is Vem pra rua, right? Come to the street. And the entrepreneurial opportunity for the emergence of this site or this group is so evident just by looking at their name. They co-opted that main slogan of come to the street from the 2013 protests for their very existence, for their very name and who they are. And originally, this group started as a social media campaign to organize anti-corruption protests, but they quickly transformed into being these major media producers, strategic media producers, and right-wing strategic media producers. And again, they had this expanded agenda. And while they also claimed to not be associated with any party, research shows that their narratives that they were spreading on social media were most definitely anti-PT, and again, paving the way for the eventual impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. And then the other actor, Movimento Brasil Livre, the Free Brazil movement. And again, look at their name. It's a callback to the Free Fair movement, which was the leftist social movement that originally started the 2013 protests. And this group strategically took to Facebook again and really focused on creating memes, on creating videos, on creating content and hashtags to delegitimize the PT. And in fact, a recent study by Stuart Davis and Joe Strabhauer talks about how this particular group was key in using Facebook and misinformation and disinformation to create this, I guess, positive image of Bolsonaro as this populist reformer who's anti-corruption and who's going to save Brazil. So what we see then is that the protests of 2013 and then continuing onward really created this opportunity for social media sites to gain traction, not just as organizers of protests or potentially even anti-democratic protests, but for them to really emerge as important media producers and content producers that circulated these anti-PT and ultimately pro-Bolsonaro narratives. And this idea of circulation then leads to the next opportunity that the protests afforded. And that's that opportunity for taking control of the narrative and spreading, diffusing the message in order to create counterpublics on social media. And when we look at the interactions, this is via Facebook or on Facebook from June 2013, we see mainstream media dominates in terms of both shares and comments. It's no surprise, right? Facebook was a fledgling social media platform back in 2013, and mainstream media had long dominated the public sphere. So it's no real surprise that they're continuing to dominate on social media. But remember, 2013 also offered those entrepreneurial opportunities for the emergence of new media actors. So by the time we get to 2015, the media landscape is changing. Now we have a multitude of different actors, and we see that the protests offered the opportunity for the new media actors, the digital native media, and the conservative social media to really emerge and gain prominence right, in a way that they hadn't before. When you look, so the first major pro-impeachment protest of, that's a mouthful, pro-impeachment protest of 2015 was on March 15th. And so if you look at how content changed before and after March 15th, or how engagement changed, you see that mainstream media engagement decreased by 26% when the protest started. In contrast, digital native media's engagement increased 170% when the protest started. And conservative social media, their engagement skyrocketed 441% when the protest started. I also found that there were positive correlations between the start of the protest and an increase in engagement for digital native and conservative social media, but not for mainstream media. So in other words, the protest provided this opportunity for the spread of narratives, for the potential creation of counter narratives or counter publics, but only for digital native and conservative social media. And this trend has continued since then. If you look at 2021, digital native media and conservative social media are still dominating this social media public sphere. And just looking at the last 12 months, mainstream media only got about 873 interactions per post, while digital native media got about 1,200 and conservative social media got about 1,500. And then here's a few charts where you can see it broken down by media outlet. I don't know if you can see it way back there in the back, but this top red line there, that's the independent digital media site, Media Ninja. And so you see that overall, they get the most interactions. But then when you look at interactions per follower, which is important to do, right? Because if you have different amount of followers, it would make sense that you have a different amount of interactions. So this sort of evens the playing field, if you will. And here we see that now it's a different digital native news site who gets the most interactions. And that's Marco Cero Conteúdo. And this is another site, that a digital native site that formed after the protest because of their disgust with how the mainstream media were covering the protests and covering other social justice issues. And they're focused on equality and promotion of social justice issues. And really, when you look at interaction rate per followers, it's the independent digital native sites who come out on top. Next, it's conservative social media. And then way down at the bottom, it's mainstream media. And considering what we talked about at the beginning with trust and the decline in trust, it's interesting to think about how trust plays into this. Because if the independent digital native media and the conservative social media sites are getting this kind of interaction per follower, that shows that their followers are engaged. Their followers trust them to an extent, which tells us something again about mainstream media and the erosion of trust there. And then also, if you look back at the spikes, right, we see spikes on the elections when more protests happen. And then we see a big spike for January 8th. And so I wanted to focus on the first 2 weeks of January of this year to really look to see, okay, well, how is this continuing? And O Globo, the big mainstream sort of emblematic example of mainstream media for Brazil, they mostly are pretty steadily have the highest engagement, right? They also have more followers than any other of these news sites. But when you look at interaction rate per followers, it's a totally different story. Now, in the green, this is the conservative Vem pra Rua, the come to the street. And they're the ones who are getting the best interaction rate per followers. And all of these interactions that I'm looking at, these include likes, these include comments, these include shares. And of course, because it's Facebook, it includes those emoji emotional reactions. And so when you look just at shares, you see that it's still the conservative social media sites that are getting the most shares, and mainstream media and digital native media, with the exception of Media Ninja, they just can't even come close. And then when we look at the angry reactions, it's a very similar story. Conservative social media get the most angry reactions per post, and Media Ninja next, and everybody else is just left behind. And looking at emotions is important because, one, we know that emotions are an important news cue for whether or not people are going to engage with and share content on social media. But we also know that emotions are key for mobilizing social movements. And anger in particular has been shown to be an important path toward protest. And so what this tells us then is that it is conservative social media that is getting all of the shares and all of the emotional reactions and all of the other types of engagement that are necessary to create a counter public sphere. And while that tells us what people are engaging with, or tells us how people are engaging, it doesn't really tell us what people are engaging with. So I looked at the post and I did a little bit of topic modeling, and I don't have very much time left, so I'm going to speed through this. and just say that the mainstream media, they're returned to focus on using the protest paradigm. So remember how in 2013 they didn't? Now they are again. And also interesting is the way that they went back and forth from talking about protesters and rioters and terrorists and attackers when referring to January 8th. And so we need more research, a better framework that's not the protest paradigm for understanding how do we analyze content for a riot or an insurrection, because it's different than a protest. And so the old paradigmatic ways of looking at it don't necessarily work in the right way. And because the mainstream media are following the paradigm, focusing on confrontation between police and protesters or police and rioters, it's interesting to think about, and I don't have data on this yet, but it's interesting to think about how much of that is because of that anti-press discourse that Bolsonaro and his partisans had been, spreading for the last couple of years. The digital native media, they don't make any kind of conflation whatsoever between the protesters and the riots. They are very clear. This is an insurrection. This is a terrorist attack. And then conservative social media, the second topic there, authentic protests. This particular category really interested me because this included posts with words like ethics and flag and indignation and with us. And these were posts that essentially created a distinction between the right way of protesting and a wrong way of protesting. And the right way, the correct way, of course, was for the right-wing protesters, and the wrong way was for the leftist protesters. So taking a very different approach to the protest paradigm that legitimizes some protesters and delegitimizes others based off ideology. And I'm going to skip through this. And I was interested, knowing the narratives that were being spread, I wanted to look at what sort of longevity they had. And for mainstream media, when you look at 2015, when you look at 2021, when you look at January 8th, we see that they get spikes in engagement when those protest events happen, but then engagement falls back off to pre-protest levels. So mainstream media don't really get to take advantage of any sort of opportunity afforded by the protests. For digital native media, though, they have those same spikes, and even more spikes than mainstream media do. And their engagement does fall off some after a big protest event, but it still stays relatively high, and it still stays higher than pre-protest levels. With the caveat that determining pre-protest levels in Brazil since 2013 is extremely difficult because it's just constant cycles of protest. But that notwithstanding, the data seem to indicate that indeed the protests offered independent digital native media the opportunity for increased engagement over time, thus suggesting the institutionalization of this digital native media counterpublic. And then the conservative social media, they had increased engagement with these events, and it never dropped back off. It just stayed consistently high, again suggesting both the creation and the consolidation of a conservative counterpublic. So combined, all of this shows us that mainstream media content is not what is dominating on social media, and at least when it comes to protests. And normally I would say that that's a good thing, because normally that would mean that we're not seeing those delegitimizing posts and coverage related to the protest paradigm. But Brazil's more complicated, and the paradigm doesn't really work always the way we would expect to there. So instead, what we're seeing is that independent digital native media, to an extent, but especially conservative social media, have created these two larger counterpublics that are challenging the mainstream dominant public sphere. And the independent digital native media counterpublic is circulating information that is pro-social justice, pro-human rights, potentially contributing to democratic mobilization. But on the right, we've got, on the extreme right, we have a different counterpublic, right? We have the conservative one that is circulating more radical, more combative information about news and protests, potentially contributing to anti-democratic mobilization. And what's more is that conservative social media countersphere is so much larger and has spread so much further than the independent digital native one, and most definitely than the mainstream one. And so there's nothing to counterbalance it, which is really leading to further imbalance in Brazil's already asymmetrical media system. And I think that this is important to think about because this can be relevant not just for Brazil, but for anywhere around the world where we see the rise of conservative social media and conservative social media users. And this new imbalance also is interesting because of the way it further contributes to media politicization. And so because we know that independent digital native media and social media are positively linked with protest participation, both online and offline, we really need to think about, what about conservative social media? How do conservative social media correlate with protest participation, radicalization, media politicization? And this, how does mobilization via conservative social media work differently, potentially, than via digital native media or via mainstream media or via activist media or alternative media? And this is especially important because when you look at the latest Latino Barometer survey data, we see that for people on the left, they were less willing to participate in democratic protests in 2020 than in 2015. So their willingness decreased. But for people on the right, their willingness increased. And because, again, we know that media and protests are so intertwined, and we know that trust in mainstream media, at least, is declining. What does that mean for protests? And that Latino Barometer data shows that people who don't trust the media are less willing to protest for democratic rights. So what all of this tells us is that we need more research, right? That seems to be the theory and the theme of today. We need to know more. We need to know more about audiences, and we need to know about why or how trust differs in conservative social media versus mainstream media versus digital native media. And we need to know more about how people are engaging with the social media. Why are they engaging with it? And how might engagement lead to radicalization? And what would that mean for politicians? And this is a question not just for Brazil, but for El Salvador and Guatemala and pretty much any other country in the region or in the world. And what does all of this radicalization and anti-democratic mobilization mean for the safety of protesters and the safety of journalists who are covering the protests? And so looking back, obviously there's just too many questions for us that we still need to have answered. And it's not so simple for us to be able to pare it down to a dichotomy of it was a Brazilian Spring or it was the rise of the right, because really it's sort of both. We see that, yes, the protests helped with the emergence and the rise of conservative social media, which is potentially contributing to anti-democratic mobilization. But at the same time, the protests also created that environment for the rise of independent digital native media that are challenging not just hegemonic mainstream media, but also now we're going to need them to challenge the conservative social media. And we also need to rethink, how do we understand this new version of an imbalanced media landscape that has these multiple competing counter publics? And it's not just the independent digital native media and the conservative social media that we need to think about in terms of the competing counter publics, but also new peer-to-peer platforms, right? WhatsApp and Telegram. How are they, like conservative social media, potentially contributing to this media politicization and the co-optation of narratives and protest narratives, and even co-optation of our very understandings of democracy and what protest actually is and why we do it. And we're out of time. So with that, I will say thank you very much. This has been wonderful. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Wow, wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to ask if you have any questions at the moment. If not, I will start. You have one there. Okay. Yeah, so if I may, yeah. So thank you very much, Summer, for this wonderful talk. So when this was happening, I was in Gezi in Istanbul, and we were also protesting. Oh, sorry. What should I do, Devesh? Go. Go away. It was wonderful to see that some of the slogans were traveling, from so we received slogans from Tahrir Square, and we were just chanting them in Gezi, and then we saw that in Brazil, people were having those banners saying that everywhere is Taksim, which was the key thing for Turkey. But my question, I guess, is more conceptual, if you will. So I think we're, we've been talking about digital media and what it could bring, in early times, oh wow, it's going to change everything. We won't have any of these anti-democratic things anymore, but then now our approach, I think, has changed a lot. But so my question is how should we change our concepts, or should we revise our concepts? So some of the concepts you just used here is public sphere. I guess you use this in the context of mainstream public sphere. But then there's all these normative understanding of public sphere. Are you using it in that sense, or how? Then the counter publics, which traditionally speaking, we attributed very positive roles, but then we know that they're competing counter publics. Therefore, maybe there is no common ground anymore. So how can we conceptualize that? Yeah.
That's a great question. How do we conceptualize it? Let's have that conversation now. Sorry, I have a hair that's driving me crazy. I think that, normally when we think about counter publics, we think about them as providing this safe space for marginalized groups to be able to challenge whatever that dominant narrative is. And so it takes a shift to think about conservatives as a marginalized group, because in some ways they're not. In some ways they are, right? It just really depends on how you look at it. And so I think that we really, basically any theory and any concept or framework that we've been using over recent years has really been, when we think about marginalized groups and social movements, a lot of that has been focused on the left. And so I think it is going to take a shift for us to start thinking about, well, how does this work when we're looking at it from the right side of the political spectrum? And there's no easy answers, right? But I think protest paradigm, for example, it doesn't necessarily work if you're talking about an insurrection led by people on the right. And I don't want to call them protesters. I think that's different than a protest. But there's plenty of people who argue that point and say, no, they are protesting. They're just protesting against change. So I think that it's going to take a lot of thought and a lot of great discussions like this for us to be able to come up with those concepts, because I do think that a lot of what we've been using doesn't necessarily work as well as we would hope it would.
Thank you. Anna, do you want to read it, or do you want me to read it? Oh yeah, of course. Yes.
Unless you want to manage with your Portuguese. Well, we have here a question from Tiago Rodrigues Lima, and he asks, taking into account that social actors in the context of 2013 were manifesting in general through corporate media, being it the traditional media or social media platforms, concerning the effects, both symbolic and politics, of the manifestations of 2013, what is it that truly distinguishes the so-called native digital media and the traditional media? would it be that one is more conservative and the other is more progressive? Or would it be related with the grade of democratic action from one in opposition to anti-democratic tendencies of the other? Can we think that one of the elements that was in play during June 2013 was that the notion of corporate was falling down in a certain way, and that the notion of corporate and democracy, and that organizes our worldviews and institutions. Sorry, I was trying to translate by reading.
Thank you for that question. And the short answer to all of that is yes. And then a little bit longer of an answer is read my book. But the real answer is that yes, the digital native news sites are able to be distinguished from traditional corporate mainstream media because of their more democratic tendencies compared to the typical conservative pro-status quo corporate media. And independent digital native media have been accused of being leftist. They have been accused of being activists. And when you talk to them, they say, no, we're not necessarily leftist. We're not necessarily progressive. We're just on the side of humanity. We're just here to defend human rights, defend democracy, and do what journalism is supposed to be doing, but that mainstream journalism has failed to do, right? So they put the onus more on mainstream media as not doing their real job and saying that this is what they're doing. They're doing a better journalism, they say, and they're doing real journalism. And then what was the last part of the question again, Anna? It was about the fragility of the notion, the corporate notion. Yeah, absolutely. So with the June 2013 protest, that's part of the reason why I say they provided an opportunity, because clearly digital native media were able to take advantage of the fact that corporate mainstream media were unable to respond to and adequately cover those protests. Cesar mentioned that, I think, right? That they're like, we don't know what we're doing. And you mentioned you saw that in Chile. I heard the exact same thing when I did interviews with journalists in 2020 in the United States. All of them say, we don't know how to cover this. And part of the problem is because journalists aren't trained to cover protests as part of a larger political social context. They just parachute in and they treat it like any other breaking news event. And you can't cover protests that way. And so I think that those are all great questions that were posed, and that really, I mean, this is going to show my bias here, but I think independent digital native media are the future. I think you had a question.
Hi, Summer. I'm Bruna. Thank you for your talk. Brilliant work. So I come from the education field, and we're doing work on conservative advances in education in Brazil. So the nonpartisan school movement and the anti-gender agenda, this sort of thing. And so just to vent a bit of conceptual ideas with you.
Please.
Something that we have been fighting really interesting is that these conservative movements, through these media that they found a really effective way to connect with people, is through common sense. Mm-hmm. So they do have a way of portraying these issues that they are fighting for in a much easier way, and in also a really emotional way. So you said about anger and trust, things that do connect with people. So there's this really effective way of saying, no one is teaching gender to my children because they are pedophiles. So if you say something like that, which mother is going to want to send their children to pedophiles? So it's really effective. And that connects with my question, which is, we saw that fear is a big emotion. And that's something that you didn't mention here. And I wanted to know if you have a wager in that, and if that makes sense. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. And to your first point about the simple narratives, that's also something that the journalists that I've interviewed who work at independent digital native sites throughout all of Latin America, that's one of the things that they talk about, is that part of the problem with mainstream media is that it's so elitist, and that they talk down to their readers a lot of times. But in addition to that, sometimes the journalists just don't know how to simplify it because it's a complicated topic that they don't know very much about. Because again, they parachute in and have to cover it. And so one of the things that the independent digital native journalists talk about is using Instagram in particular to create these very snackable items and posts that can, dumb it down, if you will, into a very simple message. And they found that they've had really good success with that, especially for feminist related issues, because in very patriarchal societies, those are themes that sometimes get dismissed or people don't want to hear them, right? But when they have been able to put them into these very simplified messages, they found that people respond very well to those, people that they wouldn't have anticipated to respond well to those. So it's kind of like, well, what do you say? If it's a pedophile, of course you're not going to put your kid there. But they have found sort of the opposite in terms of political spectrums, right? Like that if you put it in terms of, well, why would you beat your wife, right? Like if this is somebody you love, not that that's necessarily what they did, but that same idea works there. And in terms of fear, there's mixed research on the extent to which fear is actually a good motivator. And one of the emotion, of course, yes, but anger tends to be better, as well as frustration. And I think that fear is probably one of the things that I've seen in my research is that fear in terms of oppression actually keeps people from protesting. So if you can take that fear, not of oppression, but fear of the future, and make it more about anger over the future, or the possibility of hope over the future, because that's another big mobilizer is hope, then maybe we can have better luck. And so there's still a lot more research to be done here, and looking at all the posts and how much they do touch on fear is definitely a valid avenue for research.
Only one last question. Yeah, please.
Oh, it's going to be tough.
No, it will not be, definitely not. No, I really love your presentation, and you have made here and through your work a really convincing point of why the protest paradigm does not work as a model. So I wonder, we researchers, in your view, how should we study protest? Should we totally abandon the protest paradigm? Should we create other models? So how do you see, how can we move forward research also?
So I don't think it doesn't work, and nor do I think we should abandon it, because I think as a very basic model, it does work. And research that you've done, that I've done, that so many other people have done shows that it does work. It works in contexts around the world. It works in different types of media platforms, with different languages, with different types of protests and different types of media outlets. But it doesn't always work, right? So when doesn't it work? What we do then is we just talk about, well, it doesn't work, instead of saying, okay, let's take all of these cases where it doesn't work. Let's figure out what doesn't apply here. And then let's create a new framework for studying those particular cases. We haven't really done that yet. A colleague and I, Danielle Brown, she and I recently did something where we wrote an essay where we talked about we need to bring power back into it. And I think that if we can focus more on the role of power in all of this, that's a good starting point, because that would then allow us to think about protests on the right as well as on the left, without falling into this weird space of, well, how do we deal with the people who are, pro status quo when they're protesting? So if we bring power back in, I think that's a start. But let's sit down and let's figure out what that framework looks like. That's what I say. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, Anna.
Thank you, Burche. Thank you, Summer, for this session. thank you all for staying with us till the end of this seminar. Thank you all to online participants for being with us up to now. As I said to all people, if you need certificates, you can send me a message. We are only issuing certificates for those who need one, so please get in contact. I think most of you have my email address because you got the instructions for being here from it. And I would once, before finishing, just thank again all the team that were behind this seminar. All the people here, Deepesh, thank you very much. Sangeeta, thank you for your support. I would also thank you, Jesse and his team in Brazil for making online broadcasting possible. Thank you for Ayrton Gustavo, who is translating to Portuguese, and I know that there is already a lot of people saying that he did a brilliant work again. So thank you for this. And thank you for all our colleagues here, our colleagues in Cardiff, in INCTDD in Brazil. I won't try to spell it again. And from IAS as well for making this possible. It was a very nice afternoon or morning with all of you here, and I hope we'll be seeing each other again for next activities. Thank you very much.